Hello everyone and welcome to this evening's webinar on studying in the USA. My name is Holly Haig and I am one of two Education USA advisors working at the US-UK Fulbright Commission, and I'll talk a little bit more about what those organisations do. Before I jump into some of the content of this evening's webinar, I'm just going to quickly introduce myself and a bit of my background and personal connection to studying in the USA. So as I mentioned, my name is Holly and I work as one of the Education USA advisors. I also, as you can probably tell from my accent, I'm from here in the UK, but I did my undergraduate degree in the US. So was once very much sitting in your shoes quite a few years ago now. And so can also vouch for that personal experience of what a brilliant opportunity it is if you do have that opportunity to study abroad and indeed to study in the US. So just a few kind of housekeeping pieces before we get started, and then we'll dive right into questions and the rest of the presentation. So in this webinar, we're hopefully going to be here for about an hour or so of me kind of talking and running through some key information about the application process to US universities. We're going to start off with choosing a university, move into how you might fund US study, and finish up with some of the nitty-gritty of putting together a US application. At the end, we'll then open the floor to your questions, and I ask that if you do have any questions that come up, that you maybe write them down on a piece of paper nearby. And at the end, when we go into the Q&A section, that's when you use the Q&A box to type any of those in, because it may well be that your questions are covered during the presentation. And so I want to make sure that we don't miss any. So if you hold on to those questions until the end, I will be more than happy to have a go at answering those. Okay, so let's briefly start us off, and I'm going to quickly give a bit of an overview about what we do and who we are here at Education USA. So first of all, Education USA is held within the US-UK Fulbright Commission. Now, the Fulbright Commission was established around 70 years ago in the aftermath of World War II by a US senator called Senator Fulbright. And he thought that the best way to promote peace and intercultural understanding was through education. Fulbright himself had studied here in the UK, so he had that personal connection to international education. And so we are a non-for-profit organisation jointly funded by the US and UK government to promote that peace and intercultural understanding through educational exchange. There are a few ways in which we do that. One that some of you might have heard of before is through the Fulbright Awards, which are postgraduate funding opportunities for British students going to the US and vice versa. But we also, and this is kind of where I come into play, is through the Education USA Advisory Service. Now, Education USA is a global network of advisors in around 400 different centres across the globe. And so we support students in their home country, so in this case in the UK, who are interested in studying in the US. And we offer free, up-to-date and non-biased information about that process. So if you are dreaming of going and studying in the US, that is what we are here to help with. And we are the only official source of US study information here in the UK. So if you're a student, parent, teacher or academic advisor, we're here to help walk you through that process and to help kind of demystify some of that process. Okay, great. So with all of this in mind, let's start us off by talking about some of the main reasons why British students might want to go and study in the USA. Up on screen, I've got just a few short reasons, and I'll walk through kind of a bit of an explanation of some of those in just a moment, but note that this is just a short list and you may have additional reasons that you also want to study in the US or explore that option further. So the first that I've put up here is quality and reputation of US universities. In the US, there are over 4,500 universities offering undergraduate programs, as compared to about 120 here in the UK. So with that in mind, there is a huge range of personality and different styles of education that you can really tap into and really find a good fit for you that suits your individual needs and desires that you'd like to get out of your undergraduate education. Though we usually here at Fulbright and Education USA caution against putting too much weight on things like rankings, I'd also like to flag here that 5 out of the top 10 universities globally in the 2018 QS World Rankings were based in the US. And so there are many really high quality universities that have, global recognition that perhaps you haven't even heard of just yet, and that you might discover as you do your choosing and research process. And so just to bear in mind that there is a huge variety of universities in the US and that many of them have a really good reputation. Second is campus life. That opportunity to experience lots of activities. US universities are known for this kind of vibrant campus culture where students get involved and are actively encouraged to be involved. And so, you might be involved in an a cappella group or Greek life or a sport. And so that is something that is often a very attractive quality for British students interested in US study. The third one, which I can speak to from my personal interest in this when I went to the US, is the academic flexibility that's on offer at US universities. US universities follow what is called a liberal arts style of education, which encourages a broad view of studying and aims to produce a well-rounded student with a well-rounded and intersectional viewpoint. So what this means is that you'll study a range of different subjects during your degree before choosing an area in which you want to focus in on or major in, which is ultimately what you'll get your degree in. For example, I studied Spanish and Portuguese as my major, but I also did a minor in political science. And during my time on campus, I was also taking science classes and history classes and a range of different other things as well. So you can really kind of explore your options. And it means that if you're perhaps really interested in what you're studying at the minute and don't know how you want to narrow that down, or if perhaps you're not sure what it is you'd like to study, it could be a really good fit for you. Another thing to note on this is that US universities often have a really strong emphasis on teaching, on classroom engagement and environment, and have a diverse array of different students and classmates to promote that liberal arts curriculum, because you're not just going to be sitting in a room full of people who only study maths. You might be next to someone who does study maths in your maths class, but you'll also be next to someone who studies Arabic or sport. So it's a real kind of mixed viewpoint going on within your classes as well. Next up on the list are funding opportunities, and we will talk a little bit more in depth about this later on. But funding opportunities can come as a surprise to people because there is this misconception that studying in the US is very expensive. But there are many opportunities to find a variety of scholarships and financial aid opportunities as compared to the loan-based programs that we have here in the UK. Next is employment opportunities and that idea of internationalizing your CV. Studying abroad is a really appealing factor for employees. It shows that you're willing to do something bold, do something different, push yourself out of your comfort zone. And it also allows you to kind of build a network of friends, but also professional network that is very international and diverse. Added to that, you can often build employment experience through on-campus employment. On an F1 student visa in the US, you are able to work up to 20 hours per week on campus during term time and up to 40 hours a week during holidays. and sometimes even a year up to a year after you have graduated in a role that's related to your field of study. So there's that real opportunity for that kind of hands-on experience during your time at US University. And finally, it's a wonderful opportunity to learn about a new culture firsthand. It's one thing seeing it in TV shows, it's another to go and live and interact on a day-to-day with people from a different culture. You know, the US spans 6 different time zones and has a really great diversity in geography and in different cultures. And you also have really long holidays during your degree programs where you can go and explore. And as I said at the beginning of this presentation, I can really vouch for that transformative experience of studying abroad and the benefits that are lifelong afterwards. Again, before we jump in directly to some of our main content for tonight, I'm also going to go over some key differences between the US and the UK in terms of higher education. The first is the duration of programs. As I mentioned on the previous slide, US universities tend to have a little bit more flexibility in their approach in the liberal arts style of education. And because you're studying a range of different subjects before you sort of begin to narrow down, this affects the length of your program. Here in the UK, where you typically have a 3-year program, you're usually looking to do a 4-year program in the US. Next is that you apply to the university as a whole and not to one particular department, which is the same idea here in the UK, where you decide that you're going to study history and you apply directly to the history department. You are instead might say that you're interested in studying history on your application, but that doesn't necessarily commit you to doing all your classes in the history department on a US campus. So you'll be applying for admission at the whole university and not to an individual department because of that academic flexibility. Another really important thing to highlight here is that there are no set fees or deadlines with university in the US. This is because, you know, the US is the land of the free, and so each university sets its own of these. So you really want to be very careful when you're doing your research and choosing process to make sure that you have those deadlines and fees all clear to avoid missing out on putting an application in time, and just so that you don't have any surprises when you have to pay a particular application fee, or indeed knowing that different universities have different costs of tuition and attendance as well. Finally, I just want to flag here as well a couple of exceptions. Both law and medicine are programs that are only offered at the postgraduate level in the US, and they can't be studied at the undergraduate level. So if you do have questions about either of those, please hold till the end, and I'm happy to help out with those. Okay, great. Again, just pulling up on screen a couple of terminology differences that will be helpful as you embark on that choosing and research process. So here in the UK, what we call year 10 to year 13 is grades 9 to 12 in high school in the US. What we call university in the UK, there are a range of different names for in the US. Most commonly is college, but it could be university, school, or institution. And you'll probably hear me calling them all of those names throughout the evening. But college equals UK university. It doesn't mean sixth form college or anything like that. Next, again, a module in the UK is known as a class or a course. And as I was explaining before, your course is your degree program or your major or your focus or something like that in the US. So this is just really helpful to keep in mind and to be aware of as you begin to research and identify programs and schools of interest. Okay, so I'm now going to walk you through a little bit of a timeline that we often recommend students follow. And you can actually find a copy of a similar diagram on our website to help you through this. But we recommend that the whole process between, researching and starting your studies should take somewhere between 1 year and 1.5 years. So you'd typically be looking at the end of year 12, S5, or year 13 if you're in Northern Ireland. And so really is probably the most important part of the process is to research universities, with there being such a large variety out there, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. Then usually in the summertime after year 12, you're going to start registering for any required admissions exams, which will be informed by your university research, as not all universities require these. Then going into the autumn of your final year at school, you will begin to finalize where you'll be applying. And so you'll narrow that list down to somewhere between 6 and 10 schools. In that autumn time as well, you'll begin to put together your application materials and submit to the universities. In the spring of your final year, you'll then start to hear back from universities. And then, based off where you're admitted, you will also apply for your US student visa in the summertime, usually sort of 1 to 3 months before you plan to enroll. You'll then come back to us to tune into our pre-departure webinar, and pre-departure information can be found on our website, just to make sure that you're 100% ready to go and know what to expect. And then usually a little bit earlier than here in the UK, kind of mid-August, early September, you will head over to the US to begin your studies. Great. So I'm now going to move on to talk about choosing a university. And as I said on the previous slide, choosing is probably the most important step in the process of applying to a US university. And the real key to this is to be flexible about where it is you apply. As I mentioned, there are over 4,500 US universities, meaning that it can feel a bit overwhelming to narrow down your prospects and your options. But we're going to discuss some strategies and some tools that you can implement to make that process a lot more manageable. Okay. Before we dive into this, there are a couple of important points I just want to flag, because it's quite important to know some of the context of US universities as you start to narrow down your options. The first is that there is no national set standard, as I mentioned. So universities are free to set their own fees, course structure, student environment, versus here in the UK, where there's a lot of standardization, £9,000 tuition fees, and have fairly similar environments and fields. So it's really important that you get that sense through your research at US universities, so that you feel that it's a good fit where you're going to be going. As before we kind of go into the different types of institutions and everything, it's just something to be aware of, that there are a range of different institutions, from women's colleges to liberal arts colleges to research institutions. So really to just be thinking about that. We're going to talk about funding a little bit later on in more depth, but if funding is important for you and you need funding in order to make your US study feasible and a possibility, it's really important that you consider it from the choosing process. Unlike here in the UK, where we do our student finance after you've been admitted to a university and you've got your grades and confirmed your place, funding starts at the very beginning of the application process in the US. And so if it's important, you perhaps want to only be looking at universities that offer financial aid to international students, as not all universities are able to. And also make sure that it's the appropriate kind of financial aid, which we'll talk about later on. But please just note this, as it is very important to consider from the beginning. And then Final note, if you are going to be applying to US universities, you're also allowed to complete UCAS applications alongside these. Again, just be mindful of deadlines, but we would really encourage you, to apply through UCAS if you want to have that backup plan and security in case things like funding don't work out for you. Okay. Here at Education USA, we also mention a lot of the time about this word called fit. Now, what this means is, how does a university fit in with your values, and how do you fit in with it, and how does that work? This is going to be the most important kind of feature that we encourage you to think about as you are looking for universities that you might consider applying to. Programs that are a good fit for you are going to be a good fit for you academically, personally, and also financially, as I just mentioned. And so really the first place to start on this is to locate factors that are important to you. So it might be a particular program or type of department. It might have to do with the student body, whether it is a very active or sporty campus, or whether it is one with lots of collaboration, or perhaps it's more competitive. So you really want to begin thinking about those factors and what is important to you, and to broadly prioritize that. If you don't like the snow, perhaps the Midwest or the Northeast is not the best idea for you if the snow is going to be up to your shoulders every year. So really kind of thinking about some of those. If you're trying to save money, living in the middle of Manhattan is going to be a lot more expensive than going somewhere like Michigan, perhaps. So just having a think of what are those factors that are most important to me. And I'd encourage you to, again, think beyond the rankings and really, look at that wide variety of factors that are most important to get out of your experience. Within the choosing process as well, you want to make sure you're only going to actually apply to universities that you have really researched well and could see yourself ending up there for 4 years if you are offered a place. You don't kind of just want to go in on a whim and randomly apply to a couple of universities. It's important that you have taken the time to look into how they're a good fit for you. Okay. So let's talk about how, once you've got these factors and what types of institutions are available, the next step is to really kind of narrow down those options. So unlike UCAS, you're not actually limited to a set number of universities that you can apply for. In theory, in the US, you could apply to all 4,500 universities. From a time, money, effort standpoint, we really don't recommend that. Instead, we recommend somewhere between 6 and 10 universities is a manageable and realistic amount. However, to jumpstart that process of narrowing down the universities, we usually recommend to have an initial list of somewhere between 10 and 20 universities that you think could be a good fit for you before kind of delving deeper to narrow it down again. So how do you do this? First and foremost is on our website, which I can show you during the Q&A section of the webinar. We have got a whole guide to choosing, which has a lot of resources that help you narrow down your options. And we're going to go through an example of what one of those looks like just now. Okay, so this is a screenshot from a search engine which is called Big Future College Search, and you'll find a link to this on our website, as I say. And if you look down this left-hand side, you can see that there are a variety of different factors that you can narrow your results down by. So type of school, where it's located, the type of campus and its size, majors on offer, and even a tab for paying and financial aid. And I want to also flag here that under paying, there is an option to tick financial aid is available for international students. So again, that's a really quick way to kind of narrow down your options to only those that do offer financial aid for international students, if that's important. What I will flag on here is, once you don't want to just rely on a search engine like this, and you'll go in and actually do individual research on the university's websites themselves for the most up-to-date information. But this is just to give you a sense of what this platform looks like. And as you can see at the top, there is actually 3,807 universities on here before we apply any filters. So whilst it's not a centralized platform with every single university, it's probably just about as close as you can get, and is a really good starting point to use in conjunction with some of those other resources. Okay, so on this next slide, I have added a couple of filters. So here we've added that we'd like to attend a 4-year school that is medium-sized in Ohio, and that it does offer financial aid for international students. And then straight away, we can see that that has narrowed it down to just 23 results up at the top, which is a much more manageable number. And so from there, we can actually go in and click on the individual universities to learn more about them. And on Big Future, they each have a little profile like this. So in this example, we've clicked on Denison University, and they have this kind of at a glance section that goes over some of those key details, as well as some more detailed information about its deadlines, campus life, applying, paying, etc. But I also will flag here that we also have a link to Denison's university website. And so making sure that you are going through onto the university website is really important to make sure you get that most up-to-date information. Okay. Another thing from once you've done your university research, again, going onto the individual website is super important. And your ultimate goal is to select between 6 and 10 universities where you'll actually want to submit an application. Our suggestion is that you kind of separate that 6 to 10 out slightly into the following 3 types of university. So first of all, you'll have 2 what are called reach schools. Now, these are schools that are absolutely dream schools for you, where you'd be thrilled to attend, but it might be a challenge for you to get in. And note that if you're applying to ultra competitive universities, think Yale, Harvard, MIT, Stanford, Caltech, etc. These are reach schools for absolutely everyone, regardless of grades or profile. So we usually recommend having about 2 of those on your list. Then we'd go and have somewhere between 3 to 4 match schools. This is where your profile is roughly on par with their average applicant. One way in which you can do that is when you actually go onto the university admissions website pages. They usually have what is called a profile of an average admitted applicant. And so you can look at some of that information to get a sense of, okay, how do I stack up against their average admitted student? Is this a reach school? Is this a match school, etc.? And then finally, we'd also recommend that you have 2 what we call likely admittance schools. And these are, roughly equivalent to your UCAS insurance choice. Your application will likely be sort of cream of the crop amongst their applicant pool, and you'd be very surprised if you weren't offered a place. And so by having that spread of universities, it really maximizes your chances of admission if US study is your top priority, and it saves you from that disappointment. If you were to only apply to 10 reach schools as compared to that nice spread, you're probably going to have a greater chance of admission with a kind of wider spread. One thing to note when you're doing your university research on the university website, you can also find more information on kinds of programs. Often, especially during the pandemic, a lot of universities have been putting a lot of energy into doing things like virtual campus tours, virtual interviews with students about student life and things like that. You'll also find information about things like student housing, finances, and financial aid, sports, you name it. That is kind of the place to go for up-to-date information on the website. And also, I'd encourage you to check out any resources that they have that are specifically for international students, because they might help break down the process from that standpoint as well, not just the kind of standard information for domestic students. Another really great place to do your university research, and one that I can highly recommend from my personal experience, is actually on universities' social media channels. As many of you will be in this situation, particularly with everything that's going on at the moment. When I was applying to US universities, I wasn't able to go and visit or anything like that. And so when I moved to the US, it was my first time visiting the campus or anything like that, even going to the States. And so it's through the university's social media channels that I really found it helpful to get a feel for the college, get a sense of that university personality that we were talking about earlier on. What are they focused on? What do the students love about being there? From there, you also might want to talk with teachers or professors or professionals in a particular field that you're interested in for their advice on some universities that might be a good fit for you. But again, as I mentioned, the best place to figure that type of thing out is through the university website. Another thing that you'll find on university websites are the contact information for members of the admissions office, and particularly people like international student admissions officers, because they're going to be the people who know the most about the UK system and kind of specialise in helping international students. Universities really want to hear from you. Reach out, give them a call or an email to ask them any questions. Because it's a great way to demonstrate your interest, particularly at the moment, seeing as though you can't necessarily meet them at an in-person event or anything like that. It's a great way to show how interested you are in the university. And so definitely do send them an email if you do have a question that's not, easily answered on the website. But what I will say here as well is a US university won't necessarily be impressed by your parents calling on your behalf. So make sure that if you are going to reach out directly to a university, that it is coming from the student themselves. Okay, now just to give a sense of some of that variety that we were talking about earlier, I'm going to quickly show a couple of different universities that you might consider, and just to give you that sense of how diverse US campuses can be. First, we have got Middlebury College. If you're looking for competitive schools, but which are small, collaborative, offer a lot of research opportunities for undergraduate students, you might consider attending a liberal arts college like this one. Middlebury College is found in Vermont, which is known as a very liberal and artsy area of the US, as well as for its beautiful waterfalls and hiking opportunities. Then we've got Scripps College. If you are a female student who really enjoys palm trees, sunshine, and having a good time, you might consider Scripps College, which is a women's college in Claremont, California. And then finally up here, we have got Vanderbilt University. If you want to experience some Southern hospitality, warm weather, and country music, this could be a good fit for you. Vanderbilt is a private research university located in Nashville, Tennessee. Okay, now before we move on to information on funding your US study, I want to just give a quick note on the Ivy League, because it's something that we get a lot of questions about here at Education USA. And I kind of want to just give you some more information and dispel some of the myths surrounding it. So the Ivy League traditionally is actually a sporting league between the 8 oldest universities in New England. The Ivy League does not equal the Russell Group. It's not the same thing. There is no becoming an Ivy League institution or anything like that. all of these universities are private research institutions. And so if we think about some of that diversity of different institutions that are out there, you're somewhat limiting your research if you're only going to consider Ivy League institutions, because you're also not looking at liberal arts colleges, women's colleges, specialist institutions, and things like that. So it's just something to keep in mind. Although, again, we mentioned earlier about rankings and to really take them with a big pinch of salt, I also just want to kind of make the point that in the US, with there being over 4,500 US universities, if you take the top 1% of those, that's equal to about 40 universities. And these all come in the world rankings ahead of Durham University. And so if you think of the top 1% here in the UK, of 120-ish universities, that's going to be, you know, 1 or 2 universities, likely Oxford, Cambridge. And so there are some really, really highly competitive quality schools in the US that you've probably never heard of. So some of those schools on the list might include Ohio State University, University of Wisconsin-Madison, Purdue, University of Texas at Austin. And so really just to keep that in mind, that there are some really excellent universities out there that perhaps you haven't even heard of or looked into further. And so it's really worth taking the time to. And finally, just on the Ivy League and kind of feeding into that piece around making sure you've got a good spread of universities that you're applying to. The Ivy League institutions are extremely, extremely competitive. Harvard's acceptance rate was less than 5% last year, as compared to 18% at Oxford and 21% at Cambridge. And only 0.4% of undergraduates attend one of the Ivy League institutions. So just something to bear in mind. And, you know, obviously Ivy League institutions are, you know, excellent institutions, but they're not the only excellent institutions by any means that are available to you in the US. Okay, so now let's move on to finding funding. Now, funding your studies is probably one of the things we get asked most about here at Education USA. So in this section, I want to kind of be a little bit upfront about some of the costs involved in studying in the US, but also dispel some of the myths related to funding US study. One thing to note just before we get started is that finding funding for university is a challenge not only for US domestic students, but for international students alike. So we're going to kind of go through some of the costs to anticipate, some of the different sources of funding you can pull from, and then finally some strategies that you can implement to find funding. Okay, so up on screen, I have got a little bit of a summary of some of the costs to expect. The first one is more kind of a cost that you'll expect before you enroll. And then the others are sort of more based around what happens when you're in the US. So first off, we've got application expenses. If US universities require admissions exams, which again, we'll talk about in more depth later on. For an SAT or an ACT with writing, you're typically looking at around $65 US to take one of those tests. Plus, if you would like extra support or any, you know, books or materials or anything like that to prepare for those, you may need to factor that in as well. Although we do have a really robust list and set of resources on our website that are completely free to help you prepare for those. So I definitely recommend checking those out if admissions exams are something that you're required to take for universities of interest. Then is university application fees themselves. As I mentioned, each university differs so much in its fees. There's no set standard. And so many US universities will incur a fee to apply to them. although several do offer fee waivers if you're unable to meet that cost. But usually application fees sit somewhere between $50 and $100 per university. So definitely something to budget for, particularly if you are going to be applying to, between 6 and 10 universities. And then finally, you've got fees associated with your visa, your embassy appointment, and CVIS, which is essentially the international student database that the Department for Homeland Security uses. And so definitely have a look on the US Embassy website for some more information on that. But remember that you're going to have to keep in mind things like, particularly if you don't live near a US embassy, things like traveling for your visa appointment and the visa and service fees themselves. Okay, next we have got tuition fees. So as I mentioned earlier, again, these vary significantly from university to university as each uni sets its own fees and rates. Fees are mandatory and usually cover things like student union, school athletics, and membership to the university gym. And another note is this kind of funding misconception. Don't be completely put off by that kind of sticker price that you often see on US university websites that might be something like $60,000 a year. Lots of US universities operate using what is called a cost of attendance rather than tuition fees as we use here in the UK. And so that cost of attendance tends to be a lot more inclusive and all-encompassing. So it won't just be tuition fees and other fees. It will also include things like room and board, personal expenses, sometimes even travel to and from the university. And so worth kind of keeping that in mind and keeping that perspective that it is a lot more of an inclusive cost of everything that is anticipated that a student will spend. And then thirdly, up here, we have got cost of living and other expenses. So whilst that cost of attendance that I just mentioned may include things like room and board and some expenses like that, you might still also have to consider things like clothing or entertainment, and in some instances, food. It just depends on the plan that the university has. And also, much like here in the UK, cost of living can vary wildly depending on where it is that you're based. And as well, just to keep in mind the cost of rent if you live off campus, things like whether if you're in a rural area, might you need a car to get around, and as well, things like health insurance. Again, you can find more information on that on our website. But those are just some of the main costs to keep in mind and to anticipate ahead of this process. After all of that, there is some good news involved. And so the US is the land of opportunity. And so there really is a variety of funding opportunities available. And it is possible to have an affordable US education. And many students are able to fully fund their studies without loans. I am one of them. I managed to graduate debt-free from a US university. And so that's why it really is possible and key to be willing to put in the time and energy and effort to seek out those opportunities, to be flexible in where it is you apply, and to find and apply for that funding. Okay, so I'm now going to go over some of the main sources of funding that international students can access usually in the US, and of which there are 4. First and foremost is personal and family funds. US universities will expect families to prioritize a student's education and invest into that education. If you think about it culturally, perhaps on TV programs, we've heard about, students having a college fund or like saving up for several decades. There's a big culture and expectation that families will contribute towards a student study as compared to our sort of more loans-based system here in the UK. And so US universities will kind of expect and prioritize those family funds. Next are US universities. I'll go into a little bit more depth on the next slide about the different types. but there are need-based aid or need-based financial aid, as well as merit-based scholarships. And they're going to vary in how much they're able to offer to international students, and indeed if they are able to offer university funding to international students. So if financial aid is important, definitely look at universities that can offer international student financial aid. Next up, we have external funding bodies. Again, we'll talk about that in a little bit more depth in just a moment. And then last, we have loans. Now, we advise that loans be your absolute final resort after you have exhausted the other 3 bullet points on this list. Loans at US universities as an international student can be really tricky because you can't take your UK student loan with you to the US, and US loans-based companies require that you have US citizenship or permanent residency in the US, or that you have a permanent resident who can co-sign with you. You can take out a UK third-party loan, but we would really caution you that just to be careful about high interest rates involved in those, and also payback terms. Often you can be expected to start paying that loan back whilst you're still doing your studies and not earning, potentially. And so that is just a bit of a tricky situation. So if you are going to go down that route, definitely seek professional financial advice before going through that. But another thing with loans as well, if you do have US citizenship, you are able to take out a loan and apply for federal loans through FAFSA. So that is a really great benefit if you do have US citizenship to look into. So usually students will pull from a mixture of these different sources to fund their studies. Sometimes it's just 1 or 2, but it may be that you need to pull on several of them in order to make your US study possible. I'm now going to talk a little bit more in depth about the kind of 2 main types of university funding, which is need-based financial aid and merit-based scholarships. Need-based financial aid is based on your financial need, as the name suggests. And what this means is that universities calculate an amount that they think it's reasonable for your family to contribute towards that total cost of attendance. And then they try to bridge whatever that gap looks like between it. For example, if a university costs $50,000 a year, as part of your financial aid application alongside your university application, you will send in a lot of different documents that detail your family's financial circumstances. And based on that, the university might calculate that you are able to contribute £5,000 or $5,000 rather towards that $50,000 per year. You're then left with a $45,000 gap, and the university will use need-based financial aids to try to bridge that gap. And I should mention that university funding is probably the best type of funding that you can get your hands on, because it's essentially a grant. It's money that you don't have to pay back in many cases. And so that $45,000, if a university is able to meet it, they will kind of make an investment in you, as they really want to have you on their campus. And so just a note with need-based aid, it's really important when you're doing your university research to have a look about how much of that gap universities can meet. So some universities are able to meet 100% of demonstrated financial need, i.e. that whole $45,000 gap, which is brilliant. But others perhaps don't have that same level of budget for international students, so maybe are only able to meet 20% or 60% or whatever it might be. And they're usually pretty explicit about how much of that, what the percentage of that they're able to meet. So definitely make sure that you are looking on the university website for that as you're doing your research, because it will probably be really important later on down the line. Another thing is merit-based scholarships. And again, as the name suggests, these are scholarships based on merit, and they could be for a wide variety of factors. So perhaps they're looking for someone who plays the flute to join their orchestra. Or perhaps you got the top grade in your year in physics and there's a particular physics scholarship or STEM scholarship. And so each university will differ. You know, some universities offer these, others don't. And the types of merit that they're based around will vary from university to university. So these will just become more and more clear as you're doing that research. And then as well, we have sports scholarships. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail at the moment. However, this might be available through the athletic recruitment process for top athletes. And what I will say is, if you are interested in sports scholarships, we have a whole step-by-step guide to applying for sports scholarships on our website, which I would highly encourage you to check out, as well as a webinar recording that we recently did with the NCAA, which is the kind of place to go for student recruitment eligibility. So definitely check those out. Again, for more information and the most up-to-date info on university funding, you're going to want to be looking on the university website. And really to be proactive in finding that information you need. If it's not clear, as a tip, if the information is not clear about funding for international students, it may be an indicator that there isn't a great deal of funding for international students. But if you are ever unsure, make sure you're reaching out to those international admissions reps whose details should be on the website. And another thing just to flag about applying for university funding, it's typically quite straightforward and integrated into the admissions process, but different unis have different ways of going about this. So if you're ever unsure, just please check on the university website and with the reps. Okay. I've now got an example up about checking on the university website, because I know it's all very well and good to say that, but what am I actually looking for? So I've taken a screenshot here from Rice University, and this is from last year, but it's an estimate of the cost of attendance at Rice. So as I mentioned, it's a much more well-rounded fee, the cost of attendance, because it includes tuition fees, room and board, books, and personal expenses. So as you can see, it totals up at about $67,000. And as you can see down here, there's actually, at the bottom down here, we actually have a link to a Rice net price calculator. And so it can help you calculate how much financial need-based aid you might be able to access if you apply to Rice based on your current circumstances. On Rice's website as well, we also have merit-based scholarships. So I'll just read out here. We've got merit-based scholarship recipients generally distinguish themselves scholastically and personally, even within our highly competitive group of admitted students. Past recipients have included, so we've got anything from political and community service leaders, creative and performance art, math and science, entrepreneurs, scholar athletes, and exceptional writers. And we also have all admitted freshman applicants are automatically considered for merit-based scholarships. So no separate application forms or interviews are necessary. So as you can see, that's something that's integrated straight away. All you've got to do is be your wonderful self in your application in order to be considered for that merit-based scholarship. But in some universities, you might have a separate essay or something like that that you have to complete in order to be considered for a merit-based scholarship. We've then also on Rice's website got a page specifically for international students, and I'll just read out this section. At Rice University, we believe that the cost should not be a barrier to attending one of the finest institutions or universities in the country. We admit students from all socioeconomic backgrounds and fund many students who might not otherwise be able to afford a Rice education. International students who receive need-based aid will have 100% of demonstrated needs met with institutional grant aid. Rice University offers need-based financial aid to a limited number of international undergraduate applicants entering in this fall semester. And we use the CSS profile for international students in their financial aid applications. So straight away, we've got that look that international students, yes, they're eligible for financial aid. They also have 100% of that demonstrated need or that gap met, which is brilliant. And that they also use this platform called the CSS profile, and you've also got a link to go and access it. So each university in its own way will have this information on its website. It's just a case of finding it. So those pages for international students for funding will be really, really important to locate. As I mentioned, please do make sure that that funding is available for international students specifically. It really breaks our heart in the springtime when we have students who come to us and say, Holly, I've been accepted at my dream school. How do I fund it? And we get into the nitty gritty of it, and the university doesn't offer financial aid to international students, or perhaps they should have applied in the fall when they were submitting their application, and now it's too late to apply for funding from the university as it's already been allocated to another student. So really, just if funding is an important consideration, you definitely want to ensure that it's considered from as early as possible from the beginning of the process. Also really want to touch quickly on external funding bodies, which I mentioned on that initial set of sources for funding. So funding bodies may include a wide range of professional, charitable, or governmental organisations that are external to the university. So these can kind of be thought of as niche scholarships, as they have specific criteria usually that are based on the mission of the funding body. So it might be students from a particular country of origin or ethnicity or religious faith. Perhaps students with a particular interest in a certain field or extracurricular interest, gender, you name it. There is probably an external funding body out there. It's just a case of finding it. So one example of this is actually the Moorhead Kane Scholarship, which is run out of the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And it's based around 4 pillars of leadership, character, scholarship, and physical vigor. And they provide a 4-year fully funded educational experience, including, I believe it's 3 summers fully funded to go anywhere in the world. So that's just one example, but there are thousands of funding bodies. So searching will probably require quite a bit of time and dedication to kind of sift through scholarship listings and submit any separate application forms that might be required for that. And so we'd encourage students for that reason to first apply for university funding and then for external funding. And we do have a link on our website to some search engines for scholarships to help you narrow that down. Okay, finally, I also want to talk about a couple of ideas for funding strategy that you might want to consider, and these approaches can be really helpful. The first is cost of living. So in order to bring that overall cost down, you might consider moving to a university that is in a lower cost of living area. So perhaps somewhere that's more rural or something like that. Just exactly the same context of here in the UK, where living in London is much more expensive than living in, say, Lancaster. New York and California are going to be a lot more expensive than states like Ohio or Georgia. And again, if you're unsure, definitely have a look on the kind of personal expenses or cost of living expenses that are listed within the cost of attendance tables that I just showed you, because that'll give you a good guide to what the cost of living might look like as a student. Secondly, you can also look at programs with lower cost of tuition, and I'll give you an example of that on the next slide. And as we've just discussed, you might be looking at universities that are able to offer an array of different financial aid opportunities. So these are just 3 points to consider in your search in terms of funding strategy. Next, I've also just flashed up community colleges, which are an increasingly popular choice in the US as an alternative pathway that can help you save a lot of money. A community college works on a 2+2 model, which essentially means that a community college program is 2 years long. And after that 2 years, you usually are awarded with an associate's degree, which is not something that we necessarily have an equivalent of in the UK, but it's often a more professional or vocational qualification. And so the 2+2 model comes in that after you've got your associate's degree from the first 2 years, you can then transfer to a 4-year program or a 4-year institution, and you'll essentially transfer into your 3rd year, do an additional 2 years, and then come out in the same period of time with a bachelor's degree, but you've used the community college as kind of a stepping stone to get there. Up on screen, I've just got a couple of examples. So we've got Los Angeles Valley College, which is a community college, and they also have relationships with really top 4-year institutions in the local area. So we've got UCLA, USC, and Cal Poly. And so you can transfer from LAVC to one of those 3 institutions of your choosing after you've completed your first 2 years. Couple of the benefits, much less expensive route than going straight for a 4-year university. You know, if you're going to a 4-year university without financial aid, that is, you can save thousands because you're paying significantly lower for those first 2 years. You'll also find that at a community college, you've got much smaller class sizes, especially valuable for those kind of intro classes where you get that really close relationship with not only your professors, but also your classmates as well. And another benefit as well is that community college admissions process tends to be a little bit less rigorous. And so they can be a little bit more flexible with their requirements than kind of 4-year institution. So students with BTEC or other similar qualifications may be able to apply for community colleges, and you also may not be required to sit an SAT or an ACT as well. Okay, so just before we move on to the application process, I'm going to quickly run through some funding tips. Make sure you start early. If funding is important, make sure it's being considered from the get-go of your research so you don't get caught out later on. Be flexible in choosing universities. So as we said, don't just apply to universities that you've heard of or seen mentioned in films. Make sure that you are keeping your options open and looking for universities that do offer financial aid to international students and where are a good fit for you. And really thinking about kind of how you're going to be a standout applicant, kind of like the fish in the picture. You don't want to be a fish in an overcrowded bowl full of British applicants where you're not standing out. You want to be in the bowl where there's just you or 1 or 2 other people, where you can really kind of stand out for your great qualities. And where you're going to be most competitive, not only for admission, but also for funding. Okay. Nearly there. So we're now going to talk a little bit more about completing a US application. Now, to have the best chance of admission at a US university, it's really important that you have a thorough, carefully considered application package of essays and personal statements, recommendation letters, any relevant experience or extracurricular involvement as well. On this slide, I've got a little bit of an overview about some of the things that US universities more broadly are looking for in their applicants. First of all, we have got academic achievement, which is just as important in the US as it is here in the UK. But there are also a number of other factors that are considered as well as academics. When they're talking about academics, these are first and foremost measured by your GCSE and A-level or equivalent, and also any admissions test scores that might be required of you. Universities, again, are going to vary in what they require. And so you'll want to be checking for that average applicant profile on the university website as you do your research. We've then got this thing called academic fit. And so this is more to do with reasons why you'd like to study at their particular university and why you fit in with them and they fit in with you, as we were talking about. So what is it about a particular program or campus activity or mission that, NYU has over Columbia? They don't want to just know why you want to study in New York City, but they want to know what makes their institution a good fit, a good academic fit for your personal interests and goals. Then got extracurricular activity, which is a really big focus in the US. And you don't have to be involved in absolutely everything, but you do want to highlight what you're passionate about, and how you're going to contribute to any of your passions and extracurricular interests while you're a student on campus. And then finally, we've also got personal attributes. So personal attributes are kind of, things that make you who you are, and universities genuinely really want to know about those. They want to get a sense of why you're going to be a great roommate or a great person to sit next to in class. So these will be shown by things like your interest in your academic field, your character, leadership abilities, reasons for wanting to attend their university, etc., etc. You really want to convey that, who you are, and universities are always looking for people with diverse perspectives and to really make their campus as holistic as their classes are. So just something to keep in mind. Okay. As I mentioned earlier on in the presentation, unlike in the UK, you will be applying to each university individually, and they're going to vary in the platforms that they use for that, because there's no kind of centralized UCAS equivalent. And so students will be applying to usually those 6 to 10 universities individually. I should note that there is a platform called the Common App, or the Common Application, which does have around 900 universities on it. And so in that sense, it does kind of consolidate some of that more kind of background information, contact details, name and stuff like that in a UCAS kind of way. But it's not UCAS in the sense that you'll still have to tailor all of your university applications to each individual university, because they'll be asking different questions, different supplementary questions, and that type of thing. To emphasize again, there is no set standard for applications. So up on screen is just an overview of some of the most common, because there is some similarity between many universities, but this is by no means an exhaustive list, and some universities may differ from this a little bit. So check on the university websites if unsure. And so, the deadlines will also vary. Requirements will vary. So one thing that I found really helpful when I was applying was to have a spreadsheet where I was able to track, okay, this application is due on this date, these things are required. So you might want to do something similar if that's helpful for you. As I mentioned, there are some similarities, so you might be able to reuse bits and bobs of your application, but you really want to be careful with that, because you don't want to be saying, I love Harvard and I really want to attend it, and send that to, University of Chicago. That would be awkward, to say the least. So with all of that said, up on screen, we've got a kind of overview of some of the things that might be required of you. We've got an application form, which will have more of that demographic information, name, contact details, that type of thing, what school you go to, things like that. You've then got admissions exam scores. which will be sent to the university by whichever organisation administered the test. We'll talk a little bit about those later, but note that not all universities require these, so that's why it's important to focus on your university research before kind of jumping in and registering and preparing all this money into tests in case they're not actually needed of you. You've then got your transcript, which will be an official list of any qualifications that will come directly from your school. Then we've got 2 to 3 essays that you'll compile, 2 to 3 recommendation letters, which will come from recommenders at your school, which will be usually 2 teachers and someone who is like a head of sixth form, who's your counsellor. And then finally, as it's the land of the free, as we mentioned before, so each will usually come with an application fee, usually somewhere between $50 to $100, but check out if there are fee waivers available if it is difficult for you to pay this fee. Okay, I'm quickly going to go over some admissions test information, kind of what role they play, what's required, and choosing between the two. In the US, there is no national curriculum whatsoever. So there is no equivalent of GCSEs, A-levels, anything like that. And so the point of admissions tests traditionally have been for admissions officers to be able to get a sense of where students across the US are at, and to evaluate applicants from diverse areas, geographies, things like that, across the US. So as we mentioned in the timeline at the beginning of the presentation, normally you'll want to be sitting these tests if they are required of you, sort of 10 to 12 months before you plan to enroll at the US university. And they'll typically require either the SAT reasoning test or the ACT. And as I kind of alluded to, many universities, particularly at the moment during COVID-19 and the pandemic, are going what is called test optional or test flexible. And obviously several were test optional or test flexible beforehand, but now many universities recognize the difficulty involved with going to a test center and completing those exams. And so many are saying they're not required necessarily for this admission cycle. But more information on that for upcoming admission cycles is still to be determined. So it's always worth double checking with the university if it's unclear on their website. Okay, so in terms of choosing between the SAT reasoning and the ACT, these exams are seen as completely equal. Not one isn't considered better than the other. It's really just a case of personal preference and whichever one works better for you. The best way to do this, in our opinion, is to kind of sit down and take a fully timed, under time conditions mock of an SAT reasoning test and an ACT, under time conditions, and see which one works better, which one you feel more comfortable with, and which one you score best on. And once you have figured that out, put all of your time into one rather than splitting it across the two. As I mentioned earlier, there's many free online resources for this, many kind of past papers out there. So that's kind of how you'd find those. And since the content and style of the SAT and ACT are quite similar, factors more like how you handle your time under pressure and what types of questions you find most challenging are really going to help you to determine which is a better fit for you. And then finally, we've got a note on subject tests. These are only required at some of the most competitive US universities and are increasingly in decline, I suppose, because they're not really required very often. So we're not going to spend a great amount of time on this, but sometimes these will be required, and you can find more information on the College Board website about those. Okay, we've now got transcripts. So a transcript is essentially a listing of your academic qualifications covering years 10 to 13 or equivalent. It'll be generated by your school, but you may need to provide your school or your counsellor, i.e. the teacher or head of sixth form or head of year or person like that who is completing this information for you, what to include. So what I would do in this instance is to point your teacher towards our website, because we have a whole guide for schools on this. But it will include things like your GCSE scores, predicted A-levels, academic honours, information about any other qualifications that you might have earned, such as EPQ or anything like that. And it will also have some information about the school. Here, I really want to flag that there is no direct conversion between UK and US marks. So please remember that your school will report your grades as they are in sort of in the British system. We really do not recommend trying to transfer it or convert it into an American GPA, because each US university will have its own system for interpreting UK qualifications. So it's important to just kind of leave that to them to interpret where your grades fit into their system. However, it will also be helpful for your counsellor to provide some more information, usually perhaps to explain some terminology and provide as much information and background on your results and qualifications as they can. So, for example, information on how your predicted grades are calculated and things like that might be a helpful tool for universities to have on hand. And then finally, we've got the school report, which may also ask for some more details about the school itself. So the size of the school, whether it's a public or a private school, things like that. And again, we have lots of advice for schools on our website, so please do point your teachers towards that if they are not so familiar with US applications, because we have a couple of templates to help them with this. Another document that your school will be expected to put together with you are recommendation letters. And so you'll likely be gathering 2 or 3 letters of recommendation. Remember that these letters should be a marketing tool for you as an applicant. And so you'll want to pick referees that know you well, both inside and outside of the classroom, so they can kind of speak to you as a whole and all of the great things that you've been involved with. They'll also want to be talking about things like your ability to succeed at university based on things like your past academic performance, observations about how you perform in a classroom environment, any school awards that you've won or work experience that you've done. They'll also talk about things like your leadership activities and your character and ability, and also your involvement in the wider school community as a whole. Another thing that I would really highlight, particularly from personal experience, is to consider meeting with your referee to discuss your letter. It's in your best interest to help your referee with any, to write the best letter possible. And so you may wish to schedule a meeting with them to just give them some more context about why it is you'd like to study in the US, your reasons for doing an undergraduate degree, why you're interested in the particular universities that you're applying to, your future goals, your academic achievements, extracurricular involvement, just to give them some ideas and, to make sure it's fresh in their mind about why this is so important to you and things like that. And it also will give you a chance to make sure that they know when the deadlines are of these different universities, so that they can get those letters in at the right time. And then finally, this is a really important one, particularly for us Brits. American referees tend to write very enthusiastically and use a very positive and descriptive, vocabulary to discuss applicants both inside and outside of the classroom. And keep in mind that, your American counterparts will have all of this stuff written about them in their letters. And so when you're preparing your UK referees to write their letters, you know, encourage them not to use too much British reserve, and refrain from using that kind of modest language. You know, your American counterparts might be having written about them that they are the best students that their teacher has seen in 25 years of teaching. You don't want to, if you don't then want to have in your letter, you know, Jimmy is a good student. So make sure that your referees are really aware of this and to think carefully about their tone that they're using. Okay, I'm now going to talk about your essays that you'll compile as a student. And this is probably one of the most important parts of the actual application package itself. Strong essays can really set you apart from other applicants, and it gives you an opportunity to really showcase yourself to a university. Really kind of important thing to emphasize here is that your essays for US universities are not a UCAS personal statement. Instead, you're going to be submitting an explanation of kind of, or responding to a particular prompt, rather than explaining why, you know, you'd be a great physics student and have always excelled in physics and live, eat, breathe, sleep physics. Instead, you'll be responding to one of a few different essay questions. So for example, the Common App last year had 7 different prompts for students to choose from. I'll read you a couple of them just to kind of give you an idea. So one was, reflect on a time when you questioned or challenged a belief or idea. What prompted your thinking and what was the outcome? The second example is, describe a topic, idea, or concept that you find so engaging that it makes you lose all track of time. Why does it captivate you? What or who do you turn to when you want to learn more? So as you can see straight away, those are just 2 of the kind of general common application essays, and they're very different in what they're asking you to share than is a UCAS personal statement. US universities really want to get a sense of you and what makes you tick through these essays, in addition to any unique supplementary essays that they individually might ask you for. And so what I'm trying to get at here is that it's unlikely that you'll be able to compose just one essay that will sufficiently answer questions posed by multiple different universities. However, you might be able to use different bits of essays towards different universities' supplemental essays. With this in mind, a couple of writing tips as you start on your essays. Make sure that you answer the question fully. As I was reading out those examples, you'll notice that there's actually in some cases 2 or 3 different parts of the question. So make sure that at some point in that space, you're able to address all of them. Be cautious of cultural references and cliches. So if you want to write your essay about the TV show Pointless, by all means, you know, Pointless might play a really integral part in your life. However, it may not translate well to an American audience who've never heard of the TV show Pointless. So just be aware of that. Proofread, can't emphasize this one enough. If you're going to reuse bits of an essay in particular, make sure you're, you know, making sure you're submitting the correct essay. Proofread extensively and ask someone to read it for you, someone, perhaps a parent or a friend, to read it for you and offer their feedback. And kind of linked in with that is, most importantly, to really be yourself, because that is ultimately going to shine through in this process. You know, if your family member or friend can read your essay and say, you know, Holly has written that, I can tell instantly that her personality is shining through, that's the marker of a great essay. And so you want to be making sure that you, you know, express what sets you apart. Let your personality come through in that essay. It's okay to be funny or to be creative in this process, but try not to use too much informal language as well. Okay. Finally, I'm just going to spend a quick minute talking about some other opportunities in the US. If you decide a full undergraduate degree in the US is not for you, there are a couple of different routes that you can explore. The first is that you could go to the US whilst you're at a UK university through a university exchange program. Many UK universities have established exchange programs with the US or US-based study programs. For example, the University of Manchester actually has 13. So this as well is a logistically simpler process than all of the past hour and a bit has taken you, and your uni will be heavily involved in helping you arrange that. So that might be one thing to consider. Also have a variety of summer institutes. The Study of the US Institutes, or SUSI, for student leaders are short, intensive programs whose purpose is to provide groups of undergraduate students with a deeper understanding of the US, while simultaneously adding to their leadership skills. Or finally, if you really love the US, you can spend 3 whole years studying it through American Studies programs. And these often will incorporate a year abroad as well. Next, there are also internships or summer opportunities that you might be able to pursue in the US, such as through BUNAC or through Camp America. And third, and finally, we also have postgraduate study. Here at Education USA, we provide support and advice about postgraduate study as well as undergraduate study. So if you wanted to do your undergraduate degree in the UK and then come back to this later, we would be here to help you through that process. We also have the Fulbright Awards for this. And so you can find more information on other government or private exchange programs. Be sure to visit the Education USA website or one of the things above, because we have more information on there. Okay, finally, before we jump into the Q&A section, I'm just going to go over a couple of the ways in which us at Education USA can help going forward from this event. First off, we have the Sutton Trust US program. This is a program for very high achieving Year 12 students or equivalent from low-income families. It essentially supports students from the beginning of the process through researching and choosing a university to finding funding, matches you with a mentor. And one of the highlights is that you get to visit US universities. This year, with the pandemic, this has all been done virtually, but we hope that in the coming months and years that we might be able to resume going in person to visit. And most importantly, this program is free for all accepted students. Unfortunately for this year, if you're currently in Year 12, applications just closed this past Sunday. However, if you are in Year 11 or below, this might be something to keep in mind if you are eligible. Next, we've talked about this a lot throughout the presentation, but we also have our Fulbright website. If you go up here to going to the USA, there'll be a navigation down to undergraduate guide. And we have a whole guide all about some of the information that we've covered this evening that you can refer to at any time. Also take questions via phone and via email. So we are more than happy to help you whenever we can. And all that contact information can be found on our website as well. Then we also have USA College Day. This is a free event with over 170 US universities and exhibitors attending each year. It's going to take place on the weekend of the 24th and 25th of September this year, and registration will open in the summertime. You know, usually this takes place in London. We're unsure about what format this is going to take this year as the situation develops with COVID. In 2020, we held this event virtually, and so stay tuned for more information about the format of College Day this year. And as well, we also hold a variety of events about US study like this one, but also sometimes honing in on particular elements of the application process. For example, on sports scholarships or admissions tests, you name it. We have those events, and of course run in-person events around the country when we are able to. Okay, great. So that kind of concludes a lot of talking from me. And I'm now going to hand over to you all. If you have any specific questions that you'd like to ask, I would ask that you put them in the Q&A box. I'd also request that if you have a question that's quite specific, that you send us an email or give us a call so that we can talk directly about your circumstances, if that is helpful. Because I'm going to focus on more broad questions that will be helpful to the whole group. But if I'm able to get to those more specific questions towards the end, I will try my very best to. Okay, great. So the first question that I can see here is, if you apply to a university and are accepted, can you use the university's facilities like the gym, or will you have to pay? Great question, one that we spoke about a little bit before. At many universities, because of the cost of attendance, you will be, those things will be included within that. However, it will just depend on the university itself. But in the large majority of cases, yes, things like student union, access to the gym and other facilities will be included within your tuition and cost of attendance. A couple of people have asked, what is the best way to go about financial aid, and how do I know which university I would like to go to? At the end of this, later this week, we are going to be sending out a recording of the webinar, so I'd highly recommend having a look through those funding sections and choosing sections again, because we've got lots of great detail. And if you have a look on our website as well, that'll be really helpful. Okay, Greta has asked, you mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that you apply to a university rather than to a specific course. Is there a separate application process to your course? And also, does a high school diploma correlate to A-levels? So as I kind of mentioned during the application section of this webinar, your high school diploma and A-levels is not like a particular correlation or equivalency between those, and US universities will determine what your A-levels look like in comparison to what they're looking for. But roughly, yes, once you've finished your A-levels, your counterparts in the US will have finished their high school program. So in that sense, there is some kind of equivalency. And then in terms of applying to your particular course, that is usually something that you will do whilst you're on campus in the US. So you will declare your major, usually at the end of your second year or just before, once you're actually enrolled. So you first apply to the university, and then you're not necessarily connected to a particular department. You do that later on once you're actually there. Sarah has asked, where did I study and why didn't I continue to live in the US after I completed my degree? Great question. So I studied at a small liberal arts college in the northeast of the US, and had the best time and really enjoyed it. I made some really lifelong friends and can't recommend it enough. Hence why I am working now in my full-time adult job as someone who helps other people whose shoes I've walked in to go and have this experience. In terms of why I didn't stay in the US, for me, I really wanted to come back to the UK, plain and simply, because I really missed my family and friends out here. And another thing to add is that just because you've studied in the US doesn't mean that you are going to be eligible to apply for US citizenship, doesn't mean that you can stay in the US after your studies are complete. once you finish your US degree, you are able to apply for what is called optional practical training, which allows you to stay in the US for up to 1 year after graduation. But you must have found a job in a field that is directly related to whatever it was that you majored in. And so I wanted to work in something that was slightly different to what I majored in. And so that's another reason would have been complications in being able to extend my visa for that time. But it's personal preference, and I do have friends who are from the UK who stayed on to do OPT and are still out there now and loving it. So it's really up to you as to what goes on with that. Where can we find the college search? Is there a link? Let me see. So yes, on our website, I'm going to share my screen. On our website, you can find going to the USA along the top, Undergraduate Guide to University Applications. And so along the sides down here, you have the 3 different sections broken up nice and easily. To find the link to Big Future College Search, you can hit choosing, scroll down, and down here we actually have links to a range of different search engines, including Big Future College Search, which I actually have open down here. And from there, you can go in and add the different things that you want to narrow your search down by. So you might want to study business. And again, narrowed the search results down for you. Lots of questions coming in. I will get to your answers as quickly as I can, but there are a lot here. Okay. Does the Sutton Trust US program cover the cost of application fees? Samuel, great question. Usually you will be applying for a fee waiver from the university rather than the Sutton Trust covering application fees. And whether you're on the Sutton Trust program or not, this is something that you are able to do through your school. So definitely look into that option if it's applicable for you. If you are an American citizen living abroad, what type of extra federal aid would you be able to expect? Great question. I can't give a specific on sort of numbers to do with that, but you would be able to apply for FAFSA, which is federal student loans. And so I definitely recommend having a look on their website into some of those options. And you may also be eligible for financial aid from the university itself, in the same way that we've been talking about throughout the presentation. Via email, can we ask questions about personal applications? Yes, you can ask whatever you want about applications. What I will say is that we are a team here at Education USA of just 2 advisors serving the whole of the UK. So with that in mind, we advise thousands of students every year. And so unfortunately, just due to staff capacity, we're not able to provide such a service as very in-depth feedback on essays and things like that, but we are able to help in whatever way we can about the application process if something's not clear from a university, or you need any particular advice on narrowing down your search or anything like that. That's what we're here to help with. But unfortunately, just due to staff capacity, it's really difficult for us to provide that sort of one-to-one mentorship and kind of editing and things like that on application materials. Anna has asked, is the timeline for applying to a US university similar to the UK process? Anna, as we touched on at the beginning of the presentation, it takes a little bit longer because there are a lot more moving parts in the US application process, and we typically recommend between 1 year and 1.5 years to kick the ball rolling. So definitely go back and watch the recording to learn more about that, or check out our timeline, which can be found on our undergraduate guide on our website. Similar question from Aidan, is Is now the right time to be looking for unis? I'm in year 12. Yes, now is a great time to start this process. However, I would say that if you're, in year 10 or year 11, there is no time like the present to start the choosing and research process. So don't feel like you need to sit around and wait until year 12 to get started. The more time and knowledge that you have, the easier this process is going to be when you come to put pen and paper together to write your application. Okay, Emanuela has asked, how do I know if your grades are good enough to apply for a particular university? This is a great question, and again, one to have a look at that admitted student or average admitted student profile that many universities publish. One really good rhetoric or method to use is a lot of US universities will put their average ACT or SAT score on their website. And so even if you don't have to submit these, what you can do is have a look at what practice tests that you have been doing at home, just to see, okay, well, I'm kind of on par with that, or perhaps this is a reach score for me, or maybe I'm way above that score. So it might be, a likely admittance score. So that's just one way in which you can do that. Search engine was called Big Future College Search. And again, I showed you all how to access that from our website. Someone has asked me which colleges I applied to. Honestly, it was a long time ago that I applied to university, so I couldn't even tell you off the top of my head where I applied. But I remember that I applied to around 10 universities. Can the letters of recommendation from teachers be reused at different universities? Yes, typically. Again, this will just depend on what platforms the universities are using, but usually yes. And so in most cases, you'll want for your teacher recommendation letters to be reasonably broad. You won't want them to be saying, Alessandra is a great fit for Vassar College if you are submitting your application to Bennington College. So it really should be focused on you and what you can bring to any university rather than your fit to a particular university in those recommendation letters. Do US universities take into account other disadvantages rather than financial ones in terms of financial aid decision? Great question. So yes, financial aid is one area in which disadvantage is taken into account. But what I will say is that US universities take a very holistic look. They use a review process or application process known as holistic review. And so unlike many universities here in the UK, which focus predominantly on a set of grades, US universities are looking, as we said, not only just at your grades, but also your extracurricular involvement, any extenuating circumstances that might have been going on. This year, for example, on the Common Application, they had a specific question about how or if COVID had impacted students' day-to-day lives. And so students could go in and elaborate on that and share something with the universities. So yeah, if there's anything that you want to add that you don't feel has been represented in the rest of your application, there is actually a space for you to do that at the end. And so, universities are looking at you as a whole person and taking into account that holistic view, not just looking at your academics. Maya has asked, when should we start preparing for the SAT if we're in year 12? Now, again, no time too soon to be preparing for these tests if they are required of you. What I will say, Maya, is when you're doing your university research, you want to be checking, are these tests still required, and weighing up whether or not you would like to still submit them if it is optional. Note that if an ACT or an SAT test is optional, you may decide that you don't want to send it in, but you'll also want to kind of make up for that in other areas. of your application. So you'll want to be putting that time and energy that you would have been spending preparing for your ACT or SAT into you know, your essays or your extracurricular involvement. But most people tend to register for SATs take place between their penultimate and last year of school, so between year 12 and year 13 or equivalent. This means that if you get your test scores back over the summer and decide you'd like to retake it, you've still got another opportunity in the fall of year 13 or equivalent. Shadira has asked, where can I find the entry requirements for different degrees? Because I rarely find them. Okay, great question. As I was just mentioning, US universities take into account a range of different subjects and are really holistic in their review process. With this in mind, US universities don't have entry requirements in the same way that UK universities do. So you're not going to see on a US university website, you must have 3 A's to do this course or 2 B's and a C to do this course. It's much more well-rounded than that. And, you know, even a perfect set of grades doesn't necessarily guarantee admission by any means at some of those ultra-competitive universities, because they place value on so many different factors within the process. Zach has asked, how much do US universities value EPQs? I'm currently doing 4 A-levels, but thinking of doing an AS in 1 so that I can do an EPQ. Is this a good idea? What I'll say is something that's quite important, more so than potentially just like throwing yourself in to do loads of different things, which it already sounds like you're doing, is more the context and workload of you within your community and within your context. So for example, if the standard workload at your school is to do 3 A-levels and you're doing 4 A-levels, you know, that is going to say something about you and your kind of involvement within the school. And so an EPQ is obviously a nice added extra, and it shows that you know, are able to do some of that research that will be important at university. However, universities also recognise that A-levels are, you know, a mammoth task, and so I would do whatever feels best for you. It's difficult to give how universities see it, because different universities will see it in different ways. But I would go with whatever feels best for you and whichever you're most excited about doing, because either way, there's going to be a lot of work involved. Okay, Kira has asked, is doing 2 A-levels and a BTEC sufficient for US universities in general? I would say in general, most 4-year universities are expecting to see 2 to 3 A-levels coming from UK applicants. And so in that instance, yes, but it will just depend on the university itself. So if you are unsure or you want to check if your BTEC would be sufficient for admittance, I definitely just recommend, once you've done that research and have found universities of interest that are a good fit financially, academically, etc., reach out directly to the international rep to see what their experience with this is and whether they would accept that or not. Okay, what type of extracurricular activities would you recommend? So this is a great question, and I can't recommend any in particular, because it really is all about you and what it is you're passionate about and what it is you love spending your time on. That is an extracurricular activity. Anything that is outside of school that you're not required to be doing, that's an extracurricular activity. So it might be something like a sport or playing a musical instrument, which is probably more traditional, but it also might be that you have a YouTube channel, or you know, you've started, or you do esports or something like that. There really is no particular extracurricular activity that I can kind of recommend. But what I will say is that if you are the first person to do something, so perhaps you set something up, or you're the first person to do something in particular, definitely include that. If you're the best person at something, for example, the best in your county at a sport or something like that, definitely include that. And if you're the only person to have done something, definitely have that on your extracurricular list, because those three are really going to shine through about your leadership, your entrepreneurial values, things like that, and kind of going from there is a good start. But anything that you spend your time on can be an extracurricular activity. I would advise against putting things like Netflix or perhaps reading. However, if you read and write blog posts about it, and it gets X amount of viewership a month or something like that, that's a much more impactful way of reading than perhaps just reading a book in your spare time. I hope that helps. Okay. What if you're not very good at the courses you study before you choose a major? Does that affect what you can major in? I think it will probably depend on the university, but I don't think that it will impact what you're able to major in. If the course that you want to major in is the thing that you're not very good at, that's where it might be a problem. But it's more, the liberal arts side of education is more to promote you to try new things. And something that I really liked about it when I was applying to US universities is that the whole point of it is that you can go to a dinner party in later life and be able to have a conversation with every single person in the room, because you'd have some kind of common ground or experience through studying through the liberal arts education. So it's not really necessarily a case of like have to excel at everything that you're doing. It's more about giving things a go and trying to view situations from different perspectives that is encouraged through the liberal arts. But again, it will depend on the university and what requirement or prerequisites they have in order to major in particular areas. So that'll just be something to look at as you do your university research. Someone has asked, in the UK, at specific universities, if you do an EPQ, you could be provided with a lower grade offer if you receive a good grade. Is this option available in the US? As I've mentioned, US doesn't really do grade offers. If you're accepted, you're expected to maintain the level that you were or are predicted to, or that you are achieving in school. The EPQ usually wouldn't affect any offers or anything like that, because they don't have that specific set of graded entry requirements. Okay. Does student debt get written off at a certain age like it does in the UK? Ideally, you hopefully won't be in any student debt if you go to the US and are able to access some of that university funding, which is often in grant money. In the same way that we have here in the UK, because we don't have those federal loans on access to us as international students, it's not the same way, because you'll still have to pay that off, I believe. But definitely worth checking with the individual loan provider on what those terms are before agreeing to take out a loan. And as we talked about in the funding section, always making sure that you are taking those 3 steps of family and personal funds, university funding, and external funding bodies before considering loans as a final resort. As a Year 12 student, how should I prepare for the SAT or ACT exams? Would doing past papers be enough? Where can I find resources to aid me in my preparation, especially for SAT subject tests? Great question. Again, past papers are really good because they, especially if you do them under time conditions, because a lot of the SAT and ACT prep has to do with how you perform and answer questions under time pressure. So definitely past papers are a good start. There's a lot of really great resources on YouTube for preparing for ACT and SAT exams. And on our website, let me just share my screen again. Go back to applying, admissions exams, test preparation. We have a whole list of different resources that you can take advantage of. So I definitely recommend having a look on there. Okay. Guys, I've got a lot of questions. I'm working through them as fast as I can, but I still have 40 to go. So we might have to wrap up shortly, just because I'm conscious of all of your time. But if you would like me to carry on, pop a question in the Q&A box so I know that I'm not boring you all. Okay. Can you work in the US after the 4 years, or do you have to come back to the UK straight after? Already kind of answered this already, but you can apply for optional practical training for up to a year or up to 3 years if you did a STEM major to stay in the US. And so some students choose to stay in the US for a little bit to work, others choose to come back. It just depends. However, beyond that period, it can be quite tricky because you're not guaranteed US citizenship or anything like that, and you would rely on company sponsorship potentially, or perhaps even being married or something like that to a US citizen. Okay, what degree did I do in the US and how did I fund it? So I studied a range of different subjects during my time in the US. However, I majored in Luso-Hispanic Studies, which is a fancy word for Spanish and Portuguese, minored in political science, and while I was there, studied a range of different other subjects from geology to history of art to Swahili. And then in terms of funding, I used a combination of personal funds and need-based financial aid. So yeah. Could I still get funding if I wanted to study as a postgrad in the US? Absolutely. Here at US UK Fulbright Commission, we have the Fulbright Awards, which are financial grants specifically for postgrad students who are going to the US. And also universities are able to offer funding, and there are external funding organizations for the postgrad level as well. So it's a pretty similar setup to undergrad, but just slightly different because it's done in a different way from the department specifically. But yes, you can absolutely still get funding as a postgrad student in the US. If you are interested in that, we are actually hosting a postgraduate webinar early next month, so you can definitely check that out on our website and register for that. Zach has asked, do you have any specific links or websites to help with our search? Hopefully I answered that before when I showed you our choosing pages on our website, so definitely check that out. Are there compulsory modules in the first year? This will depend on each university and their system. Some universities have what is called a core curriculum, so it'll be certain classes that you are required to take in order to graduate and to fulfill the requirements of the degree. Others will have a certain kind of set of distribution requirements or something like that they call it, which are you have to take a certain number of classes in each of these broad disciplines. So it might be literature or art, but within art you could take a photography class or a film class or an art class or a history of art class or a languages class that is about art or something like that. And then other universities have what's called an open curriculum, where there are no requirements at all and you can just take any class that sounds interesting to you. So it really does depend on the university, but usually you will have to take classes outside of your major at some point, just because that's how the liberal arts system works. Okay. Does the 2+2 program have an effect on your degree. So that refers to the community colleges piece that I was talking about before. So if you go to a community college, you will, after the first 2 years, get an associate's degree. Then if you choose to transfer to a 4-year program, you'll get a bachelor's degree from that 4-year program. So in essence, you'll still come out with the same outcome, even if you had gone to that 4-year program from the beginning, you'll still end up with the same qualification. So in that sense, no, it can just be a cheaper alternative, and can also be really good if perhaps your qualifications or your grades aren't what you wanted them to be. It can be a really good stepping stone to go to a community college and to help you save a little bit of money in the process. Okay, if you go to a 4-year university in the US, do you get a specific degree, like a maths degree, for example? Yes. So essentially, you'll be coming out, your degree certificate will have whatever subject that you major in on it. So you might be doing maths, or you might even be doing maths and drama. Who knows? You can sometimes mix and match and double major in 2 completely unrelated fields. Another question about being a US citizen. Yes, financial aid is still available to you, and you also have the added bonus of being able to apply for US federal loans through FAFSA. You recommend setting up an American bank account. Tommy, I presume this is a question for when you're actually in the US. I personally did. It was just easy as a student to be able to access money quite handy, and be able to use the local ATMs and stuff without having ridiculous charges. But that's something that usually kind of the international student services will help you with. Most universities have an international orientation week just before everyone else comes to campus. So in that time, the international student services kind of help you to get set up, whether it's getting to know the local area, getting your bedding sorted, like all of that kind of stuff, opening a bank account. So that might be something that you want to consider when you ultimately study in the US. Can you take a gap year before going to uni? Yes, you can. However, gap years and the concept of gap years are a little bit more rare in the US than they are here in the UK. So usually most people will apply during their gap year rather than apply, defer their offer and go, because not all universities will allow you to defer your offer. However, things could well be changing due to COVID. And I think in the US, they're seeing a few more people who are more open to doing a gap year. So definitely something to ask about at the individual universities that you're interested in, if that's unclear, or if you have questions on that. Samuel has asked, what's typically studied before you declare a major? Again, going to vary significantly from university to university, but usually you're going to have some kind of requirement that's around literature, maths, science, language, what else? Philosophy, kind of broad requirements like that, but a little bit of everything. I kind of view it as like looking at a buffet full of academic subjects, and you have to pick kind of one of each. But again, double check on the university websites, because they make this super clear on there about what's offered academically, what you're required to take in order to graduate. So you can kind of mix and match and figure out what's a good fit for you in terms of academics. Can we submit letters of recommendation from leaders of our extracurricular activities? Yes, usually you can. But again, each university will be quite specific sometimes about the types of people that they want to fulfill the recommendation letters. Usually they'll want to see 2 to 3 coming from your school, but then if you've got an additional one, it may well be that you can have like a leader from an extracurricular activity write that reference as well. How can we best stand out and show our engagement at school when we're not currently in school? Oh, great question. And I really empathize with all of you, because I understand just how difficult this must be to be learning online at the minute and things like that. It must be really difficult. I would say, you know, perhaps it depends on, I guess, how your lessons and things are run. But if it's live lessons like this on sessions, perhaps you could be, you know, using the Q&A box and getting involved in class discussion. Perhaps you can be emailing with teachers who you plan to do your recommendation letters and talking to them, or asking them if you could have a chat with them, like a call, to discuss your options and why you're interested in US study and that type of thing. That's one way to do that. But I don't know, I trust you to be creative around this, as we are all having to be at the minute. And I'd also say that, you know, US unis recognise the extremely difficult circumstances that everyone's in around the world at the minute. And so they are obviously going to take that into account in your applications, whether that's that your extracurricular activities haven't been able to go ahead as planned this year, or, you know, perhaps your grades weren't as, or predicted grades are lower or something like that. You know, US universities are going to understand that, and there will be space for you to talk about that on your applications if it's something that you worry about. Are you at a disadvantage if you don't send the SAT in, if it's optional? What I will say is not really, because the US university has put that option in specifically for students to choose whether or not they want to. I would say if a school is test optional, I would submit that score if I think it was really going to help my application and really add something. If you think it's kind of not your best work, or you're not really proud of it and don't want to add that to your application, that's where I'd say perhaps if this doesn't showcase the best of my ability, then I don't want to add that to my application. But as I said earlier, you'll want to, if you're not going to submit a standardized test score at a test optional school, to make sure that that same energy and time that you would have spent preparing for those tests and taking those tests is put into your application in other ways. Samuel has asked, is taking a level 3 BTEC good enough? Again, BTECs are one of those qualifications that it will depend on the university, because most US universities are well equipped to seeing GCSEs, A-levels, Highers, IB. But BTEC is one that is going to vary and is more commonly accepted at community colleges than 4-year institutions. So if you are unsure and you've got a couple of colleges that you are really interested in and want to learn more about, definitely reach out to them and see what they have to say and whether they'll be able to admit you with your BTEC. Do all students live on campus, on university campus? Not necessarily. Again, it's going to depend on the university. Some universities you're guaranteed to on-campus housing for all 4 years. At others, you may only be guaranteed housing for your first year, and then you're expected to move into a flat with friends or something like that. So again, that's something you can have a look on the university website for, to get a sense of whether it's a really close-knit campus culture where everyone's based, or whether people are more dispersed across the city and things like that. How much do universities in America usually cost for international students in pounds? So US universities, as we've mentioned throughout the PowerPoint, vary really significantly on what their cost of attendance is. So you'll want to be going in, having a look at the cost of attendance and breakdown of that information on their websites. And then my best advice is that you use like an online converter to figure out what that looks like in pounds. But it's really, it would be impossible for me to give you an estimate, because as we've seen, like community colleges are significantly cheaper than 4-year institutions. Each 4-year institution varies, whether it's state or a private university. So definitely have a look on the university website of interest to get a better sense on finances. What kinds of student jobs are available on campus? That's a really good question. A range of different options out there. I had a few different jobs just to give you an idea of my campus experience. I worked as a research assistant for a professor, so I had like 2 research roles actually, which was really cool because I got to, you know, do some research and build my work experience and academic experience, and also get paid for it, and also foster those close connections with faculty. I also worked at the university admissions office as a student ambassador and a tour guide. And then I also worked as an RA, which is a residential assistant, basically, as I was saying before, an older student who lives with first year students to help them with their transition to college. However, there are other roles, and it'll just depend on the university what they have available. People might be involved in putting on productions for the college. You might be working in the library, working at a student restaurant or cafe, or any of those types of roles, like administrative roles, as I mentioned. So there's usually a large array of student jobs on campus. A friend of mine used to work in the dining hall, that kind of thing. So it just depends on what's available and what you're interested in doing. Yeah. You have to share rooms at uni. Will depend on the university and what their housing policy is, but it is more common to have a roommate, particularly in your first year in the US. So for example, I shared a room my first year, but then for my second, third and fourth year, I had my own room. So it just depends on the university, on their housing. And you can find more information about that in our pre-departure section on our website, and on the university websites too. How early can we begin applications for 2022? Usually applications will start opening up during the summer, but it's always a good starting point to get together a list of ideas that you might want to include in your application, or points that you might want to have in your essay, or topics for your essay. There's no time like the present to begin that process, because it'll just make that easier as you go to kind of input that online come August time. This is a great question. As the UK is in national lockdown, how can I boost my extracurricular involvement? I would say, of course, universities are going to understand first and foremost that now is a really tricky time, as I mentioned, and they will not hold that against you if you go to, you know, an orchestra practice 3 times a week usually, but aren't able to do that at the minute. Of course, you know, they're going to understand that and totally appreciate it. But are you, you know, carrying on practicing on your own? Is there something else that you can take up from home, or a way that you can kind of creatively go around any restrictions by being involved in online versions of things, or setting up a blog, or you know, starting something new, or like, you know, anything like that? Perhaps you've got a business idea that you want to start, or you want to volunteer in your local community to help people, if that's safe to do so and you're in a position to. So there's different ways to go around it. I'm getting really conscious of time, because I know that this webinar was meant to finish at 6 o'clock. So what I'll do is I'll carry on answering questions until past, and then if you do have further questions after that that I'm not able to get to, I'd ask that you get in touch with us by email, or double check on our website, because it may well be answered there. But I'm going to have a quick scan down to see if I can get through as many as I can. Okay, Olivia says, is IB better than A-levels? No, both are seen as equal in the US admissions process, and usually US admissions officers are used to seeing both of those grades, because a lot of people use them internationally. I would just say whichever system you're going with will be considered and accepted. That's fine. If you have extra time in exams, would you be able to get extra times for admissions exams? Yes, so I would definitely recommend, whether you're going with the SAT, get in touch with the College Board, or if you're going for the ACT will be able to help you to ask for what are called accommodations in order to get that extra time that you need to do your exam, and that'll be online on the website. Should be able to request it when you register for the tests. Could I take a loan in the UK and use it to pay for uni in America? UK student loans can't be applied to US degrees. You can't kind of transfer that student loan with you. But as I was saying earlier, you could take out a UK third-party loan, but just be really careful because of those high interest rates and usually quite long payback terms, which may actually begin while you're studying and you may not be earning at that stage. So if you are going to take out a UK third-party loan, definitely seek financial advice before doing so. Should I start preparing in year 10 and how can I start preparing? Olivia, great question. Of course you can start to prepare in year 10. The thing to be doing now, I think, is really to be thinking about factors in which that are most important to you to get out of your US educational experience and to really start that choosing process. There's no time like the present, as I've said several times tonight, than to start researching universities and looking into what's a good fit for you. But usually kind of year 12 is when you'll want to knuckle down and get really stuck into the process. Okay, and last question. Whew, don't know how I managed to get through all 79 of those, but is a major equivalent to a bachelor's degree? So your major is your area of focus that you'll declare as part of your bachelor's degree, but then you'll ultimately end up getting your bachelor's degree in your major. So kind of, but it is a slightly different thing. All right, that was the last question that I'm seeing coming up in here. Thank you all so much, all 15 of you, for sticking around through what was a very long Q&A section, but I really hope that it has been helpful. And I really hope that all of you are doing well and staying healthy. And if you do have any further questions that come up, please do not hesitate to get in touch with us via our advising line on Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, or also by dropping us an email, which I'll pop in the chat, advising@fulbright.org.uk, and we're more than happy to help you out whenever we can. Other than that, I hope you all have a wonderful evening and I hope to see you at one of our events soon. All right, bye.